So hello everyone and welcome. My name is Spencer Lau and I'm the head of NextStreet's Industrial Supply Chain Forum and a senior director at NextStreet. Thank you all for joining us for today's conversation, which is titled Looking Ahead, America's Reindustrialization in 2026. This event is produced and organized by NextStreet under our Industrial Supply Chain Forum. And so before we kick off our program, I'd like to start by introducing, or for some, reintroducing who we are at NextStreet and what is the Industrial Supply Chain Forum. NextStreet is a small business solutions company with a mission to expand economic opportunity and growth across the country. For more than 20 years, we've partnered with corporations, governments, and philanthropies to help propel the small businesses that drive America's supply chains and local economies. NextStreet's Industrial Supply Chain Forum is one of the key ways that we bring that mission to life. The forum was launched in late 2024 to support a national movement to revitalize U.S. infrastructure and manufacturing. And the forum promotes dialogue around industrial policies, regional investment strategies, and small business and workforce programs. This effort is all with a focus on expanding access and opportunity for small businesses, their workers, and communities across this country. So as we move further into our second year here at the forum, we would like to actually share a little bit more about what we do by playing a quick video, just so that folks get a sense in terms of how this effort really is coming to life.
America is amid one of the most significant industrial transformations in decades. Trillions in public and private investment, the largest commitment to U.S. industrial policy since the Cold War. At the center are small and mid-sized suppliers and contractors, along with the workers who power it all. But the businesses we need most are often the ones left behind. Small firms deliver half of U.S. industrial output and 3/4 of supply chain jobs. Yet they struggle to access capital, find skilled workers, and get the tailored business development support they need to grow. That's why NextStreet developed the Industrial Supply Chain Forum. The forum's mission is to bring together public and private sector leaders and create a platform for dialogue, knowledge sharing, and collaboration to ensure small businesses benefit in a new economic landscape. The Industrial Supply Chain Forum helps make bold ideas, solutions, and partnerships a reality. America.
Now you got a sense in terms of what the forum is. I just also wanted to mention that you can learn more about our work and what's to come in 2026 by checking out our reflections report, which we'll include a link to in the chat. But really, the main purpose of this conversation is about this panel of folks that we have in front of us. Over the last several years, U.S. infrastructure and manufacturing has made a resurgence. Since 2020 in particular, trillions in public and private investment have been reshaping industrial development and supply chains across this country. But as we enter further into 2026, America's reindustrialization is entering a decisive new phase. With massive investment and focus on manufacturing and infrastructure, one core question really remains: how do we ensure that we leverage this moment to achieve outcomes promoting economic competitiveness, growth, and opportunity? And today's discussion focuses on what's actually happening on the ground, what's working, where are there challenges, and what should practitioners and policymakers be focused on as we start this year. So our discussion today will really surface practical insights on how macroeconomic trends, federal policy, and regional implementation are shaping America's reindustrialization, and what this means for manufacturing and supply chains, and more specifically for us at NextStreet, how small businesses and workers are involved here in 2026. And so with this panel that you see in front of you, we are excited to have this group of leading experts in the field, which I'll start to introduce now. First, we have Rosemary Coates, who is the Executive Director of the Reshoring Institute and President of Blue Silk Consulting. The Reshoring Institute is a nonprofit dedicated to expanding U.S. manufacturing and supply chain capacity through research, advocacy, and industry collaboration. Rosemary is a seasoned executive with deep experience in supply chain and operations management, working across industries, including in advanced manufacturing and energy sectors. Rosemary is also an author of multiple books, including an Amazon bestseller, 42 Rules for Sourcing and Manufacturing in China, and the Reshoring Guidebook. So excited to have Rosemary here. In addition to Rosemary, we also have Ian O'Grady, who is a senior policy advisor to Arizona's Governor Katie Hobbs. In the governor's office, Ian leads strategic economic development initiatives, including advancing Arizona's semiconductor ecosystem in partnership with industry leaders, including TSMC and Intel. Um, in addition to really focusing on those economic development initiatives, Ian is focused on building long-term state competitiveness by aligning public policy, corporate investment, and supply chain growth. Ian previously worked at the NOAC Metro Finance Lab, where he co-authored the Innovative Finance Playbook to expand access to small business capital across the country. Ian is also a proud graduate of Arizona Public Schools and was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford University. So Ian, great to have you. And last but not least, we have Rohan Sanu, who is a co-founder and director of the Reimagining the Economy Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School. Ron brings more than a decade of experience working at the intersection of research and practice across topics, including economic development and state capacity. Ron's professional experience spans government and international public service, including at the City of Chicago and as the chief of staff to the chief opposition whip in the Indian Parliament. Rohan was also a member of the founding team of the Brookings Institution India Center, helping build its presence in policy engagement in South Asia. Through his work at HKS, Rohan advances new models of inclusive growth, industrial strategy, and institutional reform to help governments build more resilient economic systems. So welcome, Rohan. So now that you all have heard who we have here, we're really excited to jump specifically into this discussion. And within this discussion, we want to frame it by starting by setting a baseline of where the US economy stands today and how US manufacturing and infrastructure work as we enter into the first half of the year, what this really means in terms of investment, suppliers, and workers. And so to answer that broad question, I'm going to pass it over to Rosemary to ask you directly, from your vantage point, how would you characterize the current state of US manufacturing and infrastructure as we move further into 2026?
Well, I think we all woke up to some pretty good news this morning. The jobs report is up a little and greater than it was expected. But overall, I think manufacturing's been relatively flat in the past year or so. What we're seeing is certainly companies rethinking their global manufacturing strategy. And of course, we're the Reshoring Institute, so we promote evaluating the potential possibility for bringing manufacturing back to the US. But what we find is most companies are looking at alternative locations from China, so moving out of China to other locations in Asia and Mexico. Mexico is kind of the bright spot here. We're seeing a lot of development there and cross-border commerce growth all along the US-Mexico border. So our manufacturing in the US is flat. And I think, one of the things that's really important to realize also is that it isn't so much manufacturing coming back, it's manufacturing that's evolving. So, there are lots of sort of low wage, low tech jobs that were shifted offshore in the early 2000s, particularly to China. Those jobs are not coming back, and we don't necessarily want them back either. What we'd rather have come back is a more sophisticated job that requires better skills and that pays better wage. So that's where we're going. I think it's overall kind of positive. I wouldn't say it's rip-roaring, great. But, there is at least a mild upward trend in having companies rethink that manufacturing decision.
Thanks, Rosemary. I think that really set the stage in terms of where things stand currently around our macro environments. And as you were mentioning, the different dynamics around manufacturing and industrial output here in the U.S. It reminds me, Rohan, of some of the work that you've been doing, and specifically in the intersection between sort of the focus in terms of manufacturing output and labor markets, also the considerations in terms of different industry subsectors that are focused more in terms of manufacturing or services. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about how you think the next few years will look like, particularly for small, mid-sized manufacturers, industrial businesses, recognizing all of these different trends as it stands right now.
Sure. Thank you, Spencer. And thank you all for whoever's here, spending their time with us this afternoon. I'm battling the flu, so hopefully I'm going to keep my voice throughout this hour, but we'll see. I think Rosemary set this up really well, and I want to double click on pretty much everything she said here in terms of the various constraints to manufacturing investments at this current moment from the global competitive landscape. But there's also a lot of domestic concerns that prevent, that service constraints to manufacturing investments, from local supply chains to the lack of skilled workforce. Rosemary talked about how a lot of the jobs now are going to be the more sophisticated, mid-skilled to high-skilled jobs. And we just don't have the workforce that's trained to take on those roles. And then there's wider policy uncertainty in terms of both the coordination between federal and state apparatuses, but also in terms of certainty over time as far as policies go. But I do want to broaden, the conversation from the constraints to manufacturing growth and take a wider economy-wide perspective, for just a moment. I think we need to be really clear-eyed about what all of this means in terms of jobs and the lives of everyday Americans. As we've said, the demand here is for high-skilled jobs, for high-skilled workers, and there is a big training challenge there. But let's put that to the side for just a moment. I think the key challenge that we face, though, in terms of translating manufacturing investments at the moment to jobs and to, tangible improvements in the day-to-day lives of workers, is that because of a combination of automation, global competition, capital intensity, there'll be an increasing decoupling of manufacturing output from employment moving forward. And as that happens, we increasingly need to think about complementary services where the jobs are going to be, where the majority of jobs are going to be created. So at the local level, then, what we really do need to do is think about manufacturing anchored services rather than manufacturing alone. And I'm sure we'll dive into a lot of these elements later on in the conversation. But what I will say here is two things, to keep it, just at the outset. The first is, how do we think about who these manufacturing anchored services are? And a lot of these are going to end up being lower skilled than the manufacturing facilities themselves. So how then do we partner with community colleges, local workforce development organizations to even train and move workers into those slightly lower to medium skilled jobs? And then second is, how do we, empower the small business ecosystem for two reasons. One is to be the engine of these big manufacturing firms that are going to make investments as their local supply chains. But then the second is to create those small businesses and complementary services, which is going to be the big driver of growth. What I will end with, both, to underscore my point here on the big challenge we face, but also to set this up for the other panelists here. And I'm keen to hear, what Ian has to say about TSMC and, the experience there in Arizona. But I think the big challenge for us is going to be how do we make sure that these new low-skill service jobs that we're really relying on, like that I've really been talking about, don't just end up becoming dead-end jobs, but actually create a broader local economic development story.
Ron. And I think that really sets up the stage on where things stand right now, and understanding, to Rosemary's points, that manufacturing has been steady but potentially flat, and where we have to start to think about things is how do we broaden the aperture around sort of how we think about economic development at this moment that looks both at manufacturing and manufacturing-related services. I think as part of that, though, there is kind of a broader emphasis around manufacturing within the US. And in particular, what we've seen both in the US as well as across the globe is that really industrial policy is a new hot term. It's been more active, it's been more consequential than it has been in decades. And really, the intention around industrial policy is to focus on strategic sector growth in the US as well as in other major industrialized countries. Starting in the Biden administration, there was a resurgence around industrial policy, which really was driven by macroeconomic and global political dynamics. But now, as we look into the Trump administration, a lot of industrial policy has shifted, prioritizing different tools, different industries. And so as we sort of look at where we have been around industrial policy, where we want to go, I want to start by just actually talking a little bit about where we have been. Specifically, under the Biden administration, a lot of industrial policy centered around three main bills, the Infrastructure Bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. In 2026, each is at a different stage of execution and uncertainty. And so, Ian, I want to actually ask the question to you in this way, in Arizona and other places that you've been working with, how have really this current status of these laws shaped investment decisions, shaped how we think about reindustrialization at this moment?
Yeah, thank you, Spencer. And I really appreciate the Next Street team for this conversation. Really good timing on, I think, the uncertainty in manufacturing and also exactly the questions we're thinking about as practitioners of how to leverage these opportunities and make sure we have durable, widespread economic growth for our region. So I think the common theme across these different pieces of legislation and then, the actions now we've seen with the Trump administration is we're seeing different tools, but they're trying to reach kind of similar ends, especially as we transition from we talked about chips in terms of slowing down automotive production, other types of choke points. But now we're looking at AI and chips are as much or even more important. And so you see this continuity in a lot of different areas. Same thing with batteries. So I'll kind of go through them, I guess, maybe not sequentially, but just start with the CHIPS Act. And so where we are with the CHIPS Act is we had that first round of major manufacturer grants that went out. Those are, the Intels, the TSMCs, the Microns. Arizona, we had two recipients of those grants in terms of the actual chip manufacturers, Intel and TSMC. We're proud to say that Arizona probably has the most advanced development of those grantees. And so Intel, they're now producing their AI chips at Fabs 52 and 62. That's really exciting. It's been fun to see their development. Also, they're very kind of different footprints here in Arizona, right? Intel's been here for 4 decades. They have the robust supply chain. Almost everyone, I think, in Arizona, in the Phoenix area at least, knows an Intel employee. They have a huge footprint, and so they kept building their site. They've kept expanding, and they have a variety of services and community engagement. TSMC, they arrived on the scene in 2020 with their announcement of the initial $12 billion. They've massively expanded. They are now building their third fab. First fab is under production. It's been under production for about a year. AI chips, Apple iPhone chips, they're coming off the line. Governor Hobbs was able to go see that firsthand. Huge monument, milestone for our administration when that happened. And now Fab 2 is I think it's been under construction for a few years, and then Fab 3 we broke ground last year. And so on top of the Trump administration then announcing additional 3 fabs in that area, on top of advanced packaging and other R&D opportunities. So we are in the process of producing chips. It's really exciting for the state. I think what we're seeing now is the unfurling of the supply chain, both upstream. We have the chemicals, the different inputs that go into the tooling that goes into the manufacturing process, so TSMC can make the chips. Then you have the downstream of the testing, the assembly, the packaging, which down the road from TSMC, you have Amcor that does the packaging of their wafers, which is really exciting because right before they existed, they're the most advanced North American packaging facility in our part of the globe. Before they existed, the wafers would have to go back to Asia for packaging. Now they can do that right down the road in Phoenix. So that's really exciting for us over between Phoenix and Peoria and in the region. And so I think for the Next Street, I guess Nexus, and then the other kind of secondary service-related jobs and businesses, that's something we're deeply focused on. I think the estimate multiplier that I've seen for every, for example, TSMC, those 3 fabs will have 6,000 high-tech engineering jobs. You got to multiply that by 8 or 10 in terms of the actual overall ecosystem economic development and jobs impact. And so we're looking at landscaping has been a huge, actually, a part of this, of moving plants and making sure that we're not disrupting the natural environment, catering, other types of food businesses, on top of, clean rooms have to be clean. Where are those services coming from? That's actually a very sophisticated job on top of the maintenance and technicians. And then one other thing I'll say before we talk more about IRA and then the IIJA is that not all tech jobs are the same. And so you have to really dig in with the companies too on what's a technician, what's a PhD level engineer, because the compositions really vary. And it's really interesting to see how different those jobs are across the supply chain, across different companies. And then I'll mention just briefly IIJA. We also benefited. We have one of the largest battery facilities in LG Energy Solution over in Queen Creek in our East Valley in Phoenix, and then on top of a couple battery facilities down in Tucson. Those are really exciting projects that were, I think, spurred along with the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act has changed significantly, especially following HR1. The demand for those products is now shifting we're moving from maybe a purely electric vehicle focus to now industrial scale battery, the AI, energy needs. How can we leverage batteries there on top of drone needs in terms of battery technology? And so I think that's an interesting pivot. And then I'll mention for IIJA, I think there's a lot of classic infrastructure investment that is ongoing. I think highway investment tends to be bipartisan and carry on across administrations. I think the other exciting part of that is broadband infrastructure, which again, I think coming out of the pandemic, we thought, we need broadband infrastructure to bridge the digital divide. We have huge digital divide issues in Arizona, tribal rural areas. And now on top of that, and hopefully solving that soon as we deploy those dollars, also infrastructure for AI jobs. Everyone is going to need some sort of high quality infrastructure connection, and that is being leveraged through the AI IIJA funding and the BEAD program, which Arizona's been very quick and successful in deployment. So we're excited for the benefits of that as well. That started with the IIJA.
Yeah, that is a pretty comprehensive understanding of all those three bills, and it really showcases where there is continuity, where also there are some changes that are happening within industrial policy overall, and how it's actually flowing down into a place like Arizona. Rosemary, I actually want to follow up on this point in terms of both the things that are sort of the continuity within industrial policy, but also where there have been changes and what you see as being needed at this moment to ensure that there is that degree of continuity around industrial policy within the US.
Yeah, so I was really surprised to find out, it just never occurred to me, but I was surprised to find out that America doesn't have an industrial policy. We put funding and, we emphasize certain things from time to time, but there's no formalized written policy, not like you would find in China or some of the Western European countries or Mexico. They all have written industrial policy, which gives direction and funding to how they want to develop certain industries or certain profiles. So we've always believed that the market will decide what we should do. And I think, pandemic really exposed that as being very risky. We couldn't flex our global supply chains, and we didn't have any, abilities in the US. So we got stuck with shortages and, raw materials were not available. And, this was a real wake up call, I think, for the United States. One of the things the Biden administration did early on was to identify the top 25 supply chain vulnerabilities around the world. And out of that, they picked the 4 top ones, which were pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, EV batteries, and rare earth elements. So those were the 4 priorities. And that kind of is an industrial policy because it resulted in investment in those sectors. And certainly, we've seen the development, as Ian was talking about, of semiconductor plants all over the place, not just Arizona, but also in Idaho, in Texas, in Ohio, in upstate New York. These are big multi-billion-dollar 5 to 10-year projects that we just haven't seen the likes of before. And I think that was the spark that generated that. Continuing on to the Trump administration, there's been emphasis certainly on pharmaceuticals and on the semiconductor sector for sure. And I think rare earths are kind of tagging along behind. They aren't getting as much attention, but we're certainly vulnerable still in that area. So ultimately, while we don't have a formalized or written policy, we're seeing some investment in that direction. And I, for one, am in favor of writing a policy. I really think we need a roadmap and emphasis placed in certain sectors that keep us vulnerable.
Thanks, Rosemary. And I think that that actually tees up a great question to you, Rohan. I know that as part of your work at HTS and the initiative, that you really do study different industrial policies across the world, really. And one of the things in which we've seen within the shift from the Biden to Trump administrations is a different set of approaches that focus more on tariffs, tax incentives, direct equity investments in certain cases. And so would love to actually talk a bit about how you see the comparison of US industrial policy to how there are other approaches across the globe that really have a distinction that makes the US moment a bit different.
Yeah, I can go on forever, so you might have to stop me at some point. And I think Rosemary, again, set this up really well in terms of, the US just lacking a policy, a coherent industrial policy. I think for many years we've been thinking, I mean, and that's despite the fact that the US has a lot of economic development actors. But I think when it comes to policy, we treat development economics, we flip those words and we treat that as a problem for emerging economies and not something we need to invest in from a policy perspective ourselves, which, as we've realized over not just the pandemic, but also the really slow recovery post the Great Recession, that's just untenable moving forward. I'm going to make three broad conceptual points here in terms of how our thinking about industrial policy, but also its implementation, both federally but also locally in the US, has evolved over time. I think the first is just to recognize that industrial policy is much more than financial incentives and tax breaks. The study of industrial policy is increasingly one about local coordination, federal to local, federal, both horizontal and vertical. I wrote a piece some time ago called, and as important as having a policy is, industrial policy really is a verb. It needs to be implemented on a day-to-day basis for it to, amount to anything. It's not a policy that you can write and just, and leave behind. And as you do that, the capacity of local actors becomes more and more critical. And I think as you gave us the list of the various policies and the various programs over the last 5 or 6 years, the one that was missing, which I actually think highlights a big shift in approach, is the American Rescue Plan Act, which with the various and in terms of quantum and in terms of being able to generate headlines, not nearly as glamorous as talking about the IRA in terms of the numbers and the Chips and Science Act. But in terms of the underlying approach, a really, really important shift. A lot of the competition-based programs within it, whether it was the BBBRC or the tech hubs or even the Recompete pilot program under the Chips and Science Act, really, underscored the importance of local coalitions investing simultaneously in workforce development, small business supports, and firm incentives. The Chips and Science Act, for instance, an unstated element of that is the conditionalities of the incentives where, firms had to invest in local workforce development providers. And I think we can go back into, the history of this even happening naturally with, for instance, Kodak in Rochester, which invested in the Monroe County Community College, which became the only community college with a photonics course in the early 2000s. When Kodak went out of business, it had still trained a new generation of engineers that were able to create their own small businesses. So from a long-term economic resilience perspective, apart from just investing in a specific firm at a specific point in time, that investment in local infrastructure can have significant long-term downstream effects. And then finally, the thing I'll say is, I say all of this because researchers codified it or because policy codified it a certain way. It's a new approach. The more I talk to local economic development leaders, the more they use an ecosystem approach rather than the classic use of subsidies to attract firms from outside. So none of this is divorced from practice. It just needs to be connected to local practice much more.
Thanks, Rohan. I think that thread around local engagement, building ecosystems is certainly something that we talk a lot about within NextRead, and it's something that we want to dive further into in just a sec. But I do want to actually go back to something that you mentioned as part of the first tenet, that industrial policy isn't just financial incentives. I do think one thing that we've seen within the Trump administration has been a focus on both trade policies and very much focused in terms of tax provisions within the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Rosemary, I actually want to come back to you on this question, both in the context of sort of leveraging tariffs and trade policy as one part of the industrial policy toolkit, and then tax provisions and how those really interact with one another from the manufacturers and businesses that you work with.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I am sort of astounded at what I've seen over the last 20 years or so. I mean, it used to be that we were focused on dollars and cents and, just get me to China kind of manufacturing. And today's environment, those same decisions are much more complicated. I see my clients used to, I would sit down with the CEO and he'd say, get me to China. We know our competitors are there. Everybody's there. I want to be there. It's cheaper. And that was essentially the whole decision. Today's environment, those same CEOs are now saying, wow, we've got risk in these long global supply chains. How do I make that decision? I've got a workforce that is behind in terms of skills and training. I know Rohan mentioned twice community colleges. Their investment in developing the workforce is so important. And so it's not just taxes, but it's this whole overall idea and identification that there is so much risk. There's so many more variables in that decision. There's geopolitics, there's local taxes, there's local incentives, there's there's the workforce development. My grandfather worked for Hazy Taylor in Warren, Ohio. He was a metal worker, and he came home from work every day and he smelled bad and he was greasy and dirty, and it was awful. That was our idea of manufacturing. What we want to come back in the US and what we're trying to develop through these tax incentives and so forth is a workforce that's more skilled. So instead of people putting pegs in holes, we want people who can run the robots that put pegs in holes. And that's a different skill set involving more technology and certainly the use of computers throughout a manufacturing shop floor. I mean, the look and feel of manufacturing is very different. You had asked about taxes also. One of the things, sometimes I get clients, international clients that are trying to find a location in the US and they're really surprised. It's like dealing with 50 different countries here because every state has a different tax approach, right? So every state has different tax level. They have incentives that are different. It's very individualized. So you can't make broad sweeping assumptions about a location because of that. So, taxes certainly play a big part. The region does. We know that the American South and rural America are the cheapest places to manufacture in terms of labor and taxes. But then there are other sides to that coin, like, in a rural area, do you have a workforce, right? Do you have a skilled workforce? So, it's just the decision has become quite complicated, lots of variables, and you have to be pretty risk tolerant to make a positive decision these days.
Thanks, Rosemary. I think that maybe the intersection of both Rosemary, your comments, and Rohan, your comments is how sort of these broad-based industrial policies that are being stitched together also then come down to sort of local implementation. And Rosemary, you mentioned something that we really wanted to highlight, in that ultimately within the US, we kind of operate within a bit of a federated system in a way. And so each state is also working to implement industrial policy as well. And states, from what we understand, really play a unique role at this moment. They are conveners, they're connectors, they're capacity builders, they are financiers. And so at this moment, when we're working to try to build off sort of the top-down approaches as well as the bottoms-up, would love to pull you in, Ian, on just as an advisor to a state and working at the state level, how would you describe the unique role that state governments play at this moment of reindustrialization?
Yeah, I think about this a lot, especially coming from the other side of the table of like having worked on tech hubs and these other like conversations around, national competitions. And so whether it's the incentive side, kind of like the more Biden administration approach of like incentives and community-based development policy, or the Trump side of taxes and tariffs, it's been, they set up a national competition where then it's up to essentially states, right? Because under CHIPS Act, it was the states coordinating around the National Semiconductor Technology Center, that competition. And then also for, for example, the most recent trade deal with Taiwan, where we now know they're going to invest $250 billion in the United States. That competition then really comes down to the states. So I think states do a few things. One, actually, it was put really well by a CEO who just expanded their AI-enabled manufacturing here in Arizona. The way he put it is it's people, permits, and then power. And so those are three areas I think are, states are the best equipped to provide. So workforce development solutions, a lot of those from Department of Labor and other, they run through the state, they run through the governor's workforce councils. So we've created a robust suite of policies and focus areas, sectoral focus areas through the governor's office and through an executive order to then focus and make sure that, no matter what happens, whether it's using our community college, our great system here, our universities, our engineering schools, if you move to Arizona, you're going to be able to hire people quickly. Or they're also able to switch jobs quickly and pivot and then move up through your business. Power, we've worked really hard. We have a lot of state land in Arizona. We want permits to go quickly in terms of enabling power lines, other types of capability. Also trying to lower costs in terms of how quickly you can get that permit done. We've done a lot of work in terms of coordination between agencies, both horizontally across the state government and then vertically from federal to local to utility to railroad to tribal government. And so that's been a lot of work on our side to make that go as quickly as possible. And then in terms of permits, the New York Times did a really great piece on TSMC in terms of the sophistication of the permits that were involved when they came to Arizona. That's been a lot of my time is making sure that all the permits for both these major facilities, but then also the supply chain makes sense when we're trying to reshore an industry that hasn't been on United States soil in a long time. And, also for companies that are used to when they go to a country, they build in the country and the permits are taken care of. And so it's a whole new exercise for them. And so ramping that up, folks. And so I think states really, we're the ones that close the deal. We also saw coordination between the locals because, when a company or another another country's trade office wants to come to the United States, they really want to work at the state level. They don't, and we also as a state don't want cities competing with each other. We want to solve that coordination problem for resources and then also for site selection. And we have the Arizona Commerce Authority. They're great at that. They're the state's economic development agency. And so we really try to put them front and center in terms of coordinating and making sure that there's a front door for companies to come here. And then we can, work with the locals and make sure that a company finds a home here in the state.
You see, and I love that framework of sort of people, permits, and power. I think that really frames what a state government does in such a great way. And I think as part of that, there are different elements to it that kind of go back to the ecosystem approach that Rohan, you were speaking to as well. And state governments are really critical supporters in building industrial ecosystems, as Ian just spoke to. And so I was curious to pass the question to you, Rohan, on what distinguishes different regions of having really effective coordinated ecosystems that you've seen both in the US and abroad.
Yeah, so first, I think Ian's framework is great, and I think that's very much how we've been thinking about the role of states in this moment as well. I think it's also important to acknowledge, though, that as we think about federal versus state industrial policies, unfortunately, states just don't have the fiscal space. So that which is a major limitation on the power element of Ian's very effective framework. but that doesn't undermine the role they can play legislatively, strategically, and in terms of coordination. I'll give you two examples of one current and one historical about, this just the power at the state level, and then try and draw it to, what we've seen at the regional level. I think there's a major legislative coordination problem. I think this also gets to one of the questions here from Liz on, workforce intermediation. Our community colleges and the way they're funded are just not incentivized to, collaborate at the local level with firms, to be more agile and create, non-credit programs, or, programs that actually respond to worker needs. The focus in community college is still very much, has been trying to get people to four-year colleges as opposed to treating those 2 years as valuable enough. So if we look at that, I think Texas's recent funding changes for community colleges to be more outcome-oriented, outcome-linked, is a really important state-level role to, make sure there's not just coordination in terms of convening between local actors, but also in terms of aligning incentives. So that's, a contemporary example where you can play a critical role in connecting the dots. Historically, when you look at things like the North Carolina Research Triangle, that was very much a state level initiative to create, local R&D capabilities as opposed to, chasing something externally. And I think that really is the big shift. I alluded earlier to how the toolkit of local economic development and regional economic development actors has evolved. And it has, historically, you see a lot of local EDOs, really leveraging subsidies, site selection, and, sales to market their regions and to attract outside investors. But that role has changed really from that transactional approach to a much more transformational approach, where a lot of these actors have become orchestrators and are playing more active roles in shaping their local economies, whether it's organizations like P33 in Chicago, or whether it's the Tulsa Innovation Lab that are actively, creating, more inside out approaches to their economic development activities. The one thing I will say though is, and this, is I don't, at some level, the primary challenge that I've been thinking about these days is these are a lot of great disconnected innovations across the country. And as I look at industrial policy approaches around the world, I think this also builds on Rosemary's point about the lack of an industrial strategy, per se. And what it really comes down to is, because they're so disconnected, they seldom become more than the sum of their parts. And I've been contrasting this, at least from, the micro and institutional perspective, to the way China has conducted its industrial policy. And one framework that a political scientist, Yuan Ang, has used for China is this phrase called directed improvisation. So there's a lot of local capacity and there's a lot of local experimentation, but that's paired with, very clear direction from Beijing. Now, in a democratic setup, a command and control approach might not be ideal, but you can still envision a similar connected improvisation framework where, you build on these local experiments and you give them a larger scaffolding to actually amount to something much greater.
Yeah, Rohan, that is a really great point. And I think that one thing that we had actually talked about as a group prior to this webinar was seeing how that type of improvisation actually might be happening on the ground. And Ian, I think you brought up something that was a really important point, is that, as so much of the discussion right now about AI is about data centers. Each state, each locality is going to have to focus on how data centers ultimately play a role within both their own sort of development, but also the economic development within those regions. And so, I'd love to actually pull you in on just how you've been thinking about data centers within the context of state economic development. And in a way, is there a way that we might think about this type of improvisation that Rohan was speaking to in that particular mode?
Yeah, no, that's a great, I think, application too of kind of, I wouldn't say, I mean, I agree with Rosemary, there's no industrial strategy. I think there are industrial signals though. And so you kind of read, and what we've heard from the Trump administration too, right, is we have an AI on drones. We have an AI, or we have a executive order on critical minerals. We have an executive order on there are some workforce programs. There's a lot of guidance coming out of Department of Labor of what type of workforce we need for AI and for shipbuilding and for these other things. And so it's really we've been trying to read into those because it's also tied to funding and these similar types of competitions. And so specifically in terms of data centers, I think, Arizona is the #2 market next to Virginia in terms of data centers. We've also been having conversations in terms of what types of incentives do we need? How do we nuance this? Where should they go? What types of resources? How do we want, because they use resources very differently. And I think, if, the CHIPS Act, the IRA created these really large incentives in terms of what types of community engagement do you want? For workforce, for childcare, for natural resources, data centers, they can kind of go anywhere, right? They need specific types of resources, but it could be in a warehouse, in the exurbs, or it could be in the middle of the city. So they vary, and so they create their own like specific challenge in terms of how do you engage? There's fewer workers generally, so there's fewer touch points and fewer nexuses to like engage with different types of workforce and have that leverage. And so that's, I think, if we had this opportunity with previous investments to leverage different opportunities with what those employers need, data centers provide I think, challenge, one in terms of that type of engagement, because they can happen off on their own, but also an opportunity because they do need resources. They are resource intensive often. They do also, they're built by some of the most innovative companies. And there is a willingness to engage. And I am often asked, like, what is the template? What do you guys need for this to work for the community? And so I think that's a kind of unanswered prompt right now within both economic development and then also from what you're seeing on the news in terms of communities reacting and responding to data centers being proposed.
Thanks, Ian. I think realizing we're getting there in terms of time, and so I want to actually get to one final question, Rosemary, to you. The focus on the Industrial Supply Chain Forum really is centered on some of what Next Street's mission is, to focus on small businesses and how that promotes economic growth and opportunity across the country. And so as we're thinking about these different ecosystems and these different developments that we're seeing within reindustrialization, would love to ask the question to you of how we should be thinking more intentionally and integrating small and mid-sized businesses, suppliers into ecosystems as we continue to have these discussions.
Yeah, well, I think it's, starts with the realization that when manufacturing went offshore, so did all the suppliers. So, and, bringing manufacturing back to the US, you may say, well, yeah, we want to build a semiconductor plant, but that includes the supply chain, the raw materials supply chain, as well as the development and building of the factory, and then the distribution networks and the requirements after the product is built. I think Rohan pointed out that you need packagers after you make the semiconductor. You need to have it packaged. You need all kinds of finishing touches that were primarily done overseas in the past. So we have to rebuild those supply chains. And I think that's an important component to recognize. It isn't simply building the factory. So I think also, it's really in our best interest for all of us in the government to identify what the most important things are to sustain American life. And that's why, the top 4 issues of we need pharmaceuticals. You don't want to have pharmaceuticals made in a foreign country, and then we have an issue with that country and we can't get them. This is a problem. Or semiconductors, which we're very dependent on. The global electronic supply chain is not shifted back to the US. A lot of the development of electronics requires the kind of workforce that will remain overseas. But it would be in our best interest to try to get that developed in multiple locations, not just China. So also, location like Mexico or India or other alternative places. So I think it's kind of a shift or a movement to broaden the way we look at what we need here, but also to focus on a few items that are critical, like rare earth elements. We had mines in the U.S. that were mining rare earths until about the 1980s or so, and then they got shut down because it was more cost effective to have minerals mined and processed elsewhere. But that has become a vulnerability. So we need to focus on that, and we need to focus on semiconductors, and we need to focus on pharmaceuticals and EV batteries. These are very important for us, and that should come up to a crescendo that evolves into some kind of industrial policy. Now, that being said, every time there's a new administration, there's a different focus area. So trying to get something locked down is pretty hard, except for, I think, the top 4 or 5 products that everyone's going to agree on. We need to focus on semiconductors, or we need to focus on sustainable rare earth mining and that sort of thing. So, there's always a shift in policy. I think the lesson to be learned here, especially after the pandemic, so we have to learn to be very flexible and to have plan A and plan B and plan D, and plan C, and, so that we can change and implement different things as the environment changes or the needs change.
Thanks, Rosemary. I think that actually is a really great sum up to this whole conversation in a way in which, as we're talking about reindustrialization here in the US, that in ways that, Ian, you described it as market signals that are ultimately dictating how we are all moving in a unified way in sorts, of which then a lot of the work is happening on the ground at the state level, at the regional level, that we're hoping to build ecosystems that ultimately create sustained economic opportunity and growth in places all across the country. And so just wanted to thank you all for that part of the discussion. I want to switch gears to the Q&A. We have a couple of questions, and also would encourage folks who are on the line to also include further questions in the Q&A function. But we have Michael Banner here, who is asking a question specifically about California and how California has historically been a leading manufacturing hub in the US. And so I'd love to hear if any folks have specific California-based recommendations or market observations that you've seen relative to the work that you're doing. And Rosemary, as our resident Californian, maybe I'll start with you to go from here.
Yeah, so I live in Silicon Valley and have been in California for 30 plus years. And, we have a lot of regulations here. It's a difficult business environment, no question about that. A lot of hurdles to get over that you wouldn't find in other places around the country. However, we have the most manufacturing of any state in the nation. So, the same is true in Silicon Valley. It's very expensive here, but that doesn't keep high-tech companies from wanting to be here. So, it's a little flavorful in that regard. Yeah, and I think the economic development, just like in Arizona, as Ian was talking about, the economic development folks here are working hard to redevelop that industrial base and to bring manufacturing here. Sometimes that means, though, that you have maybe first articles that are manufactured in California and then mass production in somewhere else. So, there's a shifting model. Once again, it's this idea that you have to figure out what's plan A and plan B and plan C and what works, what the economic results are. There's no question that businesses are economic animals. They make decisions based on dollars and cents. And sometimes that means you have to peel off some of the bigger, assembly work and manufacturing to a different location. So, California is great for innovation and development of new products and, all kinds of industry, high tech and aerospace and biopharma, biotech. But, when it comes to actual production, it may be more advantageous to look at alternate locations.
Thanks, Rosemary. I think maybe a follow-up question that's linked maybe outside of California, but adjacent, is Ian, of course, as someone who is on the west of the US. How you might think about one, sort of the distinction between um, sort of the states as you're thinking about different opportunities, but also where there are regional opportunities for collaboration that may mean that certain parts of a certain value chain is in one place versus another. And if you haven't had any examples of that, especially around the TSMC and Intel build out, that would be great to hear.
Yeah, I think I think kind of the I don't know, I guess I call them legacy benefits of California, right? Of like you have this amalgamation of talent. Usually, I think like Rosemary was saying, with there are instances where there's a first factory in California, but then for scaling and expansion, they look elsewhere for a variety of reasons. And so I think a couple of different ways that those benefits may be winning, and that Arizona's benefited too, is that you know that collection of workforce and people starting companies, people who want to scale or just innovative on the construction or the process engineer side, like that's becoming, I think, more evenly distributed. We're seeing it here in Arizona. That class of worker now exists here, and so that's a new type of competition that I think it's changing and reshuffling the map. I think the other part, which you've kind of danced around a little bit, is okay. So we have AI, we have other chips, we're making these types of technologies, but it's the secondary, the downstream technology of biotech. Really excited about biotech. We have a biotech cluster here in Arizona that's really growing and enabled by our AI investments. And so I think that's maybe the type of scaling, Spencer, in terms of talking about like, okay, this isn't just service sector jobs serving a major manufacturer, but this is then I always think about it of where's the next Google going to be. How are we launching next? We create the conditions for that type of company to start, and then these are companies that have decided to invest in Arizona. But then what is the Arizona company going to be that is providing that chip design or wearable or med tech device? That's really where I'm excited. And I think we're next 5 years, that's something that I would look for in an Arizona or another state that I think that those benefits are going to equalize.
Thanks, Ian. Might pose the last question to Johan. Sort of answered it within the context of your original answers, but from Liz, that it's more focused in terms of sophisticated manufacturing jobs and what is known and real versus what is hoped for. Maybe to broaden it out, since you did answer part of it in your previous answer, to connect the dots with what Ian just said about different signals that might actually lead to ways in which different actors, practitioners, the rest, are working towards what is known versus what is sort of aspirational. How might we think about breaking down sort of that information silo that then allows for folks to know where we're actually moving towards, whether that be from a workforce perspective or from a business perspective, et cetera?
Sure. Since we have about a minute left, I'm going to keep this fast and not keep people here longer. I think the key out here is what is the local capacity for discretion versus what you need to implement because you're funded to implement that by federal policy. So, Gordon Hanson, Danny Roderick, and I have done significant work that we've titled the Place-Based Policy Supply Chain. And what we find is a lot of local intermediaries are a part of a much larger policy supply chain where you need to implement programs. And these local intermediaries have never been funded for general local capacity, but are only funded to implement those programs. Now, when you only have that ability, your capacity to create new programs to demand to meet existing new demands, or your capacity to take a longer term view of your economy versus implement the programs you're being funded for is severely constrained. I think that's again a place where I was glad to hear Ian talk about taking that long-term, forward-looking view of seeing an existing opportunity as a multiplier, not as the sum and substance of your economic activity. And the role a state can play in supplementing that local capacity to do that can be really critical. But I do think we need to recognize that intermediaries are funded, whether by philanthropy or by government, to implement programs, not necessarily to use their discretion and do things to respond to market demands in a more agile way. And I think if we can change that local incentive, we can really alter the dynamics of our institutional constraints.
Thanks, Ron. Well, I know we're up on time here, and I think that was also a good closeout to where we have it for this conversation. So first off, I just want to thank you all for joining us, and a special thank you to you all on this panel for sharing your insights, your time, your expertise. It's been a really great conversation just to kind of set the stage and where we stand in terms of reindustrialization. And so for folks who may have missed any part of this conversation, we'll be sending a follow-up email with the recording on the webinar, speaker contact information, and links to the resources that we've shared throughout the chat. And if you're interested in learning more about Next Street's Industrial Supply Chain Forum, we'd encourage you all to explore our newsletter as well as our reflections report, which we will again include from here. And please don't hesitate to reach out to Next Street if you'd like to discuss any partnership opportunities, programming, or ways to get involved.